Hey guys, Thrasher here, and it's time we talk about this soft cap that's been going around and how it exactly works. Let's talk about it right now. Okay, so the soft cap, there's a lot of information going around, and I think a lot of it is wrong. So let's start with some facts here. Fact 1, there is a soft cap. Fact 2, it is not 40%. Now, let's get into how damage calculations actually work in the game. I'm going to keep this as little math as humanly possible and just give you guys the concepts here and then give a couple examples to show you how exactly it would work. First thing I want to do is explain that there are a lot of modifiers to the way that damage works in the game. One, you have a base amount of damage that you do for every single level that your character gains. So if you go from level 1999 up to level 2000, you actually get a damage boost just for that level itself, not even for the stats that your character has. So, keep that in mind. The actual damage buff per level is irrelevant to what we're talking about here, but if you really care, it's 26.7 plus 0.3 times the level of your character. So, essentially what that means is every time your character levels up, their base damage is going to level up incrementally. That is then multiplied by the art's power of whatever art you're using. That art's power is pretty much the same across all characters, so that really doesn't differ either. The only way that changes is when you go in and soul boost and you see those purple cards that need to be upgraded. As you upgrade your blast card, you upgrade your strike card in the soul boost area. That will increase that modifier, the art's power, by a small amount. Great, so now we have our base damage that comes from our level, we have our damage modifier that comes from our art's power, and then we have tertiary damage, which is the last thing we're going to talk about before we start talking about the actual stats and how they affect it. So the other things we need to factor in are any type of buffs that say increase to damage. Not increase the stat, but increase the damage. So if something says increase 10% to strike damage, that's a modifier. If there is color advantage, so if you have color advantage over a character, double your damage. If you have color disadvantage, cut your damage in half. And then there's one last modifier which actually happens after all these other calculations. So we'll talk about that a little bit more, and it's crit. And crit can change a little bit, but essentially what it means is after we've done all of our calculations, if there's a crit, it increases damage by 25%. Now let's talk about the one piece we didn't talk about, which are the actual stats. So your strike attack stat, your blast attack stat, your strike defense stat, your blast defense stat. Those are the parts that are going to change the most, and let's talk about exactly how those work as far as scaling them up with Z abilities, scaling them up with equipment, scaling them up with any other possible way to do that. So the first thing I want to mention here is people say that Z abilities have a 40% soft cap. What they're actually talking about there is that Z abilities can, among other things, give boosts to your base stats. They think that you can only increase your base stats by 40%, and after that you get pretty heavy diminishing returns. Sort of, that's true. But let's actually break it down a little bit more than that. You would think that as you increase your attack stat, your attack damage, whichever attack stat you're talking about, your attack damage is going to go up. It'll look like this, right? It'll just keep going up like that. That's not the case. What it actually looks like, rather than trying to explain with my fingers what it looks like, I'm going to throw it up in the top right there, and let's take an actual look at it. What you see here is on the bottom, that is the ratio of the attacker's attack stat divided by the defender's defense stat. So if it's blast damage, it would be your blast attack stat versus your defender's blast defense stat. Now, here are a couple things to notice. After all the other things go into place, this specific modifier in the whole equation can only change how much the damage is going to increase or decrease from 1/2 up to 3. So whatever value you come up with after you add all of the other variables, let's say that your damage was going to be 100,000. If your attack stat is absolutely minuscule compared to your opponent's defense stat, then that's only going to decrease the overall value of your entire attack by half. Now let's say the other way. Let's say that your attack stat is absolutely gargantuan, it's essentially infinite, and your opponent's defense stat is almost 0. That's only going to increase the damage that you're going to do after factoring everything else in by 3. So that's pretty much the range, is 50% up to 300%. One other thing to notice on this chart is in order to get a 1-to-1 where this doesn't really modify, it doesn't increase or reduce the damage, is that your attack stat divided by your opponent's defense stat should come out to a ratio of 1.2. That's where it equalizes at 1. Now, here's what you need to know. If you're a defender and you take your opponent's attack stat and you divide it by whatever your defense stat is, and that value is larger than 1.4, it is very, very good. You're going to get a better than 1-to-1 return if you increase your defense stat in some way, whether it's through Z ability, whether it's through equipment, whatever. Once you pass 1.2 and that value keeps getting smaller, because obviously your defense stat is going up, so that 1.2 is going to go down to 1.1, 1.0. As you divide it out, the return is going to be diminishing. You are not going to see any type of noticeable diminishing return until you get to something up like 2 times their attack stat. Or if you flip it around, if you are the attacker and their defender, if you keep increasing your attack stat, you're not going to see any type of noticeable diminishing return until you're close to 2 times their attack stat. So what that means is, in most cases, you don't need to worry at all about these diminishing returns. One thing to note here, though, is if you have something that's going to increase your attack stat by 15%, and then you have some other option that's going to increase your attack damage by 15%, unless your attack stat is below that 1.2 ratio I talked about, the straight damage is always going to be a better option. Now, to give a specific example so we can show you what this means, let's open up Broly real quick, and we'll go down to his stats. So we see that his strike attack is 77,204. We'll just say 77,000, essentially, just to make this easy math. And then we back this out. So now we want to look at this Goku. We're going to assume he's attacking this Goku, so we need to look at the strike defense of this Goku. Let's go ahead and open this up, and the strike defense of this Goku is approximately 55,000. So what we would do is we'd take the attack stat, which is 77,000, we divide it by the defense stat, which is 55,000, and we see that it's about 1.4. What that means is that this Goku will get a better than 1-to-1 defensive reduction if he increases his base defense stat, because he's below that 1.2 threshold that we talked about. On the other end, the Broly would actually get a better return if he can get a 10% straight damage buff instead of a 10% strike stat increase, because he's already beyond the 1.2 threshold. And that's all you really need to remember. And like I said, until you get up to something like a 2, 2.1, 2.2 times the difference in value there, it doesn't matter. You're not going to really notice the diminishing return there. And truth be told, in most cases, we don't have enough options as far as equipment and Z ability partners that we really need to weigh these factors in. But that's really all you have to keep in mind is 1.2 is the golden number. Your attack stat wants to be at least 1.2 times higher than their defense stat. And if it is, then a straight damage increase is always better than a strike stat or blast stat increase, assuming that the values are the exact same. If the values are not the exact same, just go with whatever has a higher value, because diminishing returns probably won't affect it enough to reduce the strike or blast stat below the straight damage increase. And that's all I have for this video. If you guys think I missed anything that's really important, throw it down below and we'll talk about it. And if you like this content, make sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.